All right, so I'm not going to recap what we did. I think everybody was here last week or a month ago, either in purpose or online, but just to sort of, like they do on some TV shows, right, in our last episode, right? So we finished up with Kaplan's view of God as this sort of the sum total of powers in the universe that make for salvation, without really defining what salvation is, because I don't think Kaplan really defined that either. And then we started discussing the Holocaust, where I posited that, and obviously you need not agree with me, but that I posited that in the wake of the Holocaust, the traditional view of God needs to be jettisoned, right? That if you posit, right, the traditional view of God has posited that God is both benevolent and omnipotent, right? And, unless you are going to somehow say that, the Holocaust was either deserved, right? That the Jews deserved what happened to them during the Holocaust as some sort of punishment, or that the Holocaust was actually good in some way that is kind of occluded from us that we can't see, then you have to conclude that either God could have stopped the Holocaust but didn't, in which case he's omnipotent but not benevolent, or he wanted to stop the Holocaust but couldn't, in which case he's benevolent but not omnipotent, right? And but we didn't really explore how different thinkers have dealt with that because we ran out of time. So I'm going to have, and this sometimes happens in the Torah. You have a story, and then that story is interrupted by another story, and then we go back to the original story. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to leave the Holocaust to the side for a few minutes and talk about feminism as a challenge to the traditional Jewish God. Okay, and I have to say, in general, both Holocaust theology and feminist theology, I am not an expert in either area, but if I may be immodest, I think one of my talents is taking sort of like exalted academic scholarship and digesting it and making it intelligible to people. Not that everybody sitting around here isn't bright and educated, but not necessarily in these particular fields. Okay, so obviously the first feminist issue with traditional God views is that images of God in literature and liturgy are almost exclusively male, right? Mm-hmm. But this is not the only problem, but it's the beginning. It's the beginning of the problem. I think that, and we can all say, right, and I say this, fairly frequently, that when we speak about God as He, right, pardon the crudity, but it doesn't mean we think God has a penis, right? Doesn't mean that we think God is actually male. But nevertheless, the way we talk, impacts and reflects our thinking, right? And even if you don't use male terminologies for God, I think contemporary feminist theologies would say that we still tend to think of God in stereotypically male ways, right? That God gives commands, right? And I am not sure that I agree with this, but I need to, put it out there that many feminist theologians, Jewish and Christian alike, have said that the idea of a God who commands, that hierarchy is in essence a male concept. Okay, that men tend to be hierarchical, women tend to be collaborative. Okay, so that even if we take great pains to avoid using male pronouns for gods, and even if, vulgar rabbis stand up there and say, this doesn't mean God has a penis, when we think about God as giving orders and telling us what to do, that sort of makes God male by default, right? That God as God as the head of the hierarchy, that is a male God concept.
I just have been reading science fiction.
Okay.
And there's she's actually passed away in 2000. Her name begins with an E, black lady, and her whole series of books is all on the fact that our sociology, not just theology, but our sociology is hierarchical, and there's a whole problem with it in fact being hierarchical.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of struck me because she was a big feminist.
Right. So, the problem that I have, aside from the fact, certainly most of us in our careers have at one point or another by now had a female boss who could be quite what?
Or been a female boss.
Or been a female boss, right? Or both.
Right.
Well, I've never been a female boss, but female bosses can be quite as hierarchical as male bosses. So I'm not sure that that's necessarily the case.
Can I just,
please.
With the hierarchy, it's just that our society is so structured. It's kind of hard for me. I find it's kind of hard to say that hierarchy is purely male. You have this society. You just have the whole society is structured that way, in a way. And
right, but I could respond by saying, but who structured the society
well, of
that
course,
way?
and this gets back to what is, when this was all designed.
Right.
This was a male-dominated world, and you can't get away from that.
Right, and that's the segue, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So my first problem with that critique is that the relationship between God and humanity in tradition is hierarchical.
Right.
You can't, it's very hard to get away from that, right? But where the segue is, the first sort of important book of what I call second wave Jewish feminism, and by second wave I mean these kind of theological issues, right? First wave Jewish feminism is simply equal access, right? We want women to be rabbis. We want women to be cantors. We want women to count for the minyan. We want women to lead services. We want women to be able to put on tefillin, whatever. But that challenges gender roles in Judaism, but it doesn't challenge the very nature of Judaism itself, right? That's first wave. That's the feminism of egalitarianism or equal access, right? Which certainly in conservative Judaism is uncontroversial.
Except the one synagogue.
Well, there are still a handful of non-egalitarian conservative synagogues left. There's more than one. There's one in the D.C. area.
I only know one in Deerfield, Illinois.
All right, there's Moriah in Deerfield,
right.
And there's Har Zion Agudas Achim in Silver Spring, and there's one in Harrisburg. I'm sure that there's more than those three, but you know, basically it's pretty uncontroversial, right? But Judith Plaskow's book, Standing Again at Sinai, and it took me a while. I mean, I had read the book several times before I even understood the title. Perhaps because I'm dense, you know, or perhaps because I was more defensive then than I am now about the tradition. But why is it called Standing Again at Sinai? So if you read the account in Exodus of the revelation, the theophany at Sinai, right? God tells Moses, tell all the people to get ready for my appearance on Mount Sinai, wash your clothes, and tell all the people do not go near a woman. And I said, well, but that applies to men and women. No, it doesn't, because when you say tell all the people don't go near a woman, women are not part of all the people, right? And even in egalitarian congregation, well, I mean, in non-egalitarian congregations, you have that problem. I mean, one of the first articles about this was called The Woman Who Wasn't There, right? Because you could have in an Orthodox synagogue, right, 8 men and 5 women in the room, and they'll say, we need 2 more people. Yeah. No, we need 2 more men. We have 13 people, but we only have 8 men. Okay, but we do that too, and I object to it sometimes. Not vis-a-vis men and women, but we could have 8 Jews and 5 non-Jews, and people will still say, what? We need 2 more people. I say, no. We have lots of people. We need 2 more Jews, right? Because by saying we need 2 more people, it also implies, right? It implies, in the Orthodox synagogue, it implies that women aren't people. And in our synagogue, when we say it implies that non-Jews aren't people, right? Because a minyan is not 10 people; it's 10 Jews, right? But so the argument when it says, "So tell the people, do not go near a woman," is that from its very beginning, women were not considered part of the people. Okay, and that Judaism developed over 3,000 years in a context where the people meant the men, right? And so, therefore, it is not enough simply to give women equal access as of 1985 to a system and a culture and a tradition that was from the very beginning designed by men, you know, of men, by men, for men, right? That the imaginative exercise is to go back to Sinai and ask yourself, not what does Judaism look in 2020 now that women have been equal for 35 years, right? But what would Judaism look like in 2020 if women had been equal for 3,000 years, right? How would Judaism be different, okay? That's what Judith Plaskow says we need to do, okay? It's a brilliant argument. It's a fascinating experiment. I don't know how you could do it, but it occurred to me, I was thinking just tonight about an analogy, right? I mean, this whole argument in American society about reparations, right? And in other words, what would American society look like if Africans hadn't been slaves?
Right. I thought of that when you said
right, because you know I can say with great confidence that none of the ancestors of anybody sitting in this room owned African slaves in this country,
They weren't even
right?
here.
But right, exactly,
Turn here and down.
right. But 6 out of the 7 of us,
Yeah.
nevertheless, benefit from having white skin,
Of course.
right? And it's not something that we asked for. It's not something that, but it's just a fact, right? Is it an accident that the average African American family has 10% of the wealth of the average Caucasian family? It's not an accident, right? And so reparations is in essence, right, an attempt to go back to 16 whatever and say, what would America look like if this had never happened, right? Yeah.
We might not have as many blacks. The black population might be much lower if
Right,
we
but
to begin with.
yeah, but I'm talking about, in terms of economics
Yeah.
Well, if they
and
had
Not
always
just
been an
economics, just
Yeah, just
plain
like,
interreligious.
right.
right,
Being
right,
scared to death, but
Right.
then they walked down the street with a hoodie up. I mean,
Right.
it's the
Right.
whole different, the whole culture,
so
societal.
yes,
You could use that same thought as what would the Jewish world be like if the Holocaust never happened?
for sure.
You could use that same, like, our population would be bigger.
Right. The difference is that we can't create that world, right? We can't bring back the 6 million people who were killed, right? But we could conceivably transition to a Judaism that is far more egalitarian, far less hierarchical, far more collaborative, do that thought experiment and then say, okay, that's what Judaism would look like. From now on, that's our Judaism, right? And we could possibly, even in America, I don't know that we could undo racism, right? But we could, if we had the will, undo the economic effects of racism, right? We don't have the will to do that. But we could, if we want. It would be massively expensive, and all of us would have much lower standards of living. But we could do it if we as a society decided that that's what we wanted to do, right? But, I mean, so for me, that kind of second stage of feminism, while I'm sympathetic to it, and I think this is what makes conservative Judaism conservative, is that even though, as I've said before, that in many ways it's a misnomer. We're a liberal religion. But nevertheless, the Judaism that we've inherited is the Judaism that we have, right? And we have both the right and the responsibility to continue its evolution, right? But we evolve the Judaism that we received, not the Judaism that we wish we had received, right? Not the Judaism that we would have received if we could somehow magically undo 3,000 years of sexism, right? I mean, so, ultimately, like I say, although, it's an interesting thought experiment, and, and in some ways, that warning about the dangers of hierarchy is in place. I mean, it's one of the reasons why, I generally sit in the congregation rather than sitting up on the bima, because and it's also one of the reasons why I dress the way I dress. I mean, that is a conscious ideological choice. It's not merely that it's cheaper to wear regular clothes than to wear a suit and a jacket and tie, and a tie every day. It is cheaper, but that's not. But it's also it's a sort of conscious ideological choice to say, I differ from you in my knowledge of the tradition, right? I'm not ontologically different than any other person, right? So, I think that awareness of the dangers of hierarchy, I think is well placed. But ultimately, I have to say, to me as a conservative Jew, I could do that thought experiment perhaps, but that's not my Judaism. My Judaism is the Judaism that we've inherited, and then we put our own stamp on it going forward.
I agree, because you look at just culturally, the way things develop, you deal with what you've inherited, and you work to improve, if you want to say. You build on it, but you don't throw out
The baby with the milk.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I think some of what they talk about, the new feminism. I'm an old lady, so maybe that affects my. But I just find it really extreme, and yet I feel that women have a role.
Right,
We
sure.
should be independent.
Or you wouldn't have had your career if you didn't
That's
feel that way.
absolutely
Right.
true.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, I agree with them, and I think there's value in looking at the way civilizations used to be, and I'm sure there's feminists that also want to rewrite the Bible and everything else. But to me, I don't know, there's value in looking at the way civilization and our people looked at themselves back then. And I don't really think, whether you're a feminist or not, in my estimation, you don't have any right to do that. It looks like revisionist history. You don't really, if you want to just rewrite it for your own personal benefit, but for, say, a movement to suddenly say, okay, we're going to redo this and throw this out and do this, then they're no better than people that are revising the Holocaust history. That's the way it was, and I think that women certainly have the right to, be rabbis and be part of the congregation and the minyan and all that stuff. But I don't see what's wrong with looking at the Bible and saying, okay, that's the way they were.
Well, all right.
It's also
Go on.
what they chose to include and exclude when they
The
made a
other-
compendium.
And when you look at pieces of it, because I just finished a course on looking at Gedona Mir, the wisdom books, and there are really
Sure.
strongly anti-feminist, I wouldn't say feminist, that were really demonizing women in some of them. But this reflects the periods of when they were
Right.
written.
But there's
That out.
right. My response to what you say is that there's a difference between erasing or rewriting history and saying, yes, that's history, but that doesn't bind or obligate
Right.
us. Like
That-
for
yeah.
example, like if you look at, taking down the Confederate flag or Confederate monuments or renaming all these places that are named after Robert E. Lee. And people say, oh, you're erasing history. No. Nobody's saying the Confederacy didn't exist or Robert E. Lee didn't exist or Stonewall Jackson didn't exist. But there's a difference between marking something for historical memory versus honoring, right? But by the same token, when people go crazy about the fact that you can buy Mein Kampf, how can you study the Holocaust without reading Mein Kampf, right?
Part of
people should,
literature,
right?
Right.
People should be able to read it so they know how evil it was,
Yes.
right? I'm not comparing the Bible with, but in other words, so I would never want to say, well, let's take all those wisdom books out of the Bible, right? But they're not normative for us,
they
or
aren't,
we
but-
could, we could take the good stuff and discard the bad stuff.
But you learn from everything, and you get a positive lesson or a negative. But it's how people have thought, and I think this is very, for human development, intellectual. You really need to know.
You build on what was
Right.
there before. It's like Washington. Washington old slaves. Well, gee, that was. You can't blame the man. Totally.
That's another.
Jefferson, too.
Well, this is another thing. You look at what the culture was at a time, and
then you
can't
evolve
apply
past it.
21st century values to the 17th or 18th
Right.
century.
Well, it's
Right.
the whole Torah that
Yeah.
we're always thinking, boy, how could they have done that?
Yeah, but
And sacrifices and
Right, but
Somebody brought that up this morning.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there are like timeless lessons in the Bible. You mentioned sacrifices. While human sacrifice was looked down upon in the Bible, the Akedah story just illustrates that in full. And talking about slavery and how the founding fathers were the product of their time. Well, the Bible was written long before then, and then it showed that slavery was a horrible thing, and it should not be forced upon your fellow kinsmen. And if you do, here are the restrictions.
But it said your fellow kinsmen, but it didn't say about others.
Right.
But it
No,
None of it Jewish.
right. So no, I don't disagree. But I mean, here's where I, and then we'll move on from this. But here is where I have a problem with some contemporary critiques of stuff in the Bible, okay, is that, you can look at some particular thing in the Bible, right, and say, oh my God, right? But don't think you're the first Jew in history to say, oh my God, right?
and it's still there.
Right? In other words, maybe Maimonides had the same problem you had. Maybe Rashi had the same problem that you had, right? And so then, like, for example, sacrifices. Okay, well, Maimonides wasn't enamored of the sacrifices either, okay? But what he said was, this was what was necessary in that culture. Right now, if you push Maimonides the next step forward, then I think you take Maimonides out of orthodoxy, because it's clear to me that Maimonides did not want to see sacrifices reestablished, right? Whereas the normative Orthodox position is that they do want to see it reestablished, right? But on the one hand, I mean, we should not remove mention of sacrifices like Reform Judaism does. We should not pretend that they didn't exist. We should not say that they were bad. They were of their time and place, but they're not of our time and place, right? So, Sue.
Shows that those changes are made
Right,
as society
Which
moves
is
along.
how the religion survived. too.
right.
Well, in Islam, they do practice sacrifice for one holiday, and that meat is given to poor people. And I honestly think that if that was done, I wouldn't have a problem with it, because it would be feeding people that may not have any food on their table.
Right, and I mean, the question is not slaughtering animals, right? And also, I mean, it is a misconception that the sacrifices were burned up on the altar. Mostly they were not. Mostly that was the way that the Kohanim were paid, essentially, was they got the meat. But there is this practice, primarily in the Hasidic community, but not exclusively, of kaporos, right? I don't have a problem with the fact that chickens are slaughtered, right? I mean, chickens are slaughtered every Shabbos, and that's right. Although I've also heard that in fact most of that meat is just thrown away because it can't be processed in any kind of safe way anyway. But not safe way, a safe
Same
way.
Um,
Right? But I mean, the bigger problem is the way that those chickens are treated before they're slaughtered.
Yeah,
Right? Now, look, obviously, I'm not a vegetarian, right? So it will be certainly hypocritical of me to say that killing animals is always wrong. It's not, right? Or it might be, but then I'm a hypocrite, okay? But yet, I mean, to me, like if you want to know what it probably looked like, okay, go on YouTube and type in Samaritan Passover, okay? Because the Samaritans still do the Passover sacrifice, and I have to say, I've not been to it, but I have watched it on YouTube. Once is enough. I don't. And I have to say, I mean, maybe I'm a bad Kohen, right? But I have no desire to go back to that, none whatsoever. I'm not ashamed of the fact that it happened, and of its time and of its place, and certainly it is better to sacrifice sheep than to sacrifice human beings,
which is what was done at the
which is
time.
what was done at the time. Right, but at the same time, I mean, Barnaby, you are absolutely correct that Hebrew slavery was far more humane than Hittite or Canaanite slavery. The problem that I have is, therefore it's good now, right? Therefore we shouldn't criticize. But you've surely seen Orthodox polemics that say exactly that. We should never criticize anything that happened in the Tanakh or in Chazal, because they were, I'm not saying you buy that, but that literature is out there. That literature is out there. Okay, let's segue. Jewish responses to the Holocaust. Okay, and I have a list of more than a dozen. No, more than 20. All right. God is dead, right? I mean, that is clearly one response to the Holocaust. And I have to say, I mean, and you don't have to be a sophisticated theologian. I mean, it's interesting. I have relatives in Israel, as many of us do. And every family has their own story, right? But I have essentially, so there's some relatives that when my grandparents came here, they went there, right? I have some relatives who were in Israel from the 1920s or 1930s. I have other relatives who stayed in Lithuania, survived concentration camps, and then went to Israel not until the 1960s, okay? And so, at the same time that I was studying theology in Jerusalem, my great aunt said to me, and we spoke, and she didn't speak Hebrew very well, but she doesn't speak English. I speak neither Yiddish nor French, so we communicated in Hebrew. And she said to me one day, Shehayiti b'machane, when I was in the concentration camp, Amarti, I said, Ein Elohim, there is no God. Right? What am I going to say to her? Right? There's somebody who went through a concentration camp and says, when I was in a concentration camp, I said to myself, Ein Elohim. You're going to argue with such a person? Right? And so there are plenty of Jews who, in the wake of the Holocaust, say, Ein Elohim, right? I don't agree with them, but I'm not going to argue with them, right? I mean, it's not exactly an irrational response to the Holocaust. And while I'm on that, I mean, one of the things, so you hear people who survived the Holocaust, right? And they say, because God was looking out for me, right? And again, there are things that you don't argue with people about, and I would never argue with somebody about that. But okay, and it is appropriate. If you survived, it is appropriate to be grateful to God that you survived. But why did God look out for you and not for 6 million other people, right? In the same sense that, I said to somebody, we never had the follow-up discussion, but at some point we will. A few weeks ago, Nancy Pelosi spoke at Gaithersburg High School, and I went to her talk, and the invocation was given by an African-American Baptist minister, smart woman with a PhD, and she gave a great rousing invocation, okay? But theologically, I thought it was very problematic because she said, she essentially said, God has chosen Nancy Pelosi to be the speaker at this time, to blah, blah, blah. And right? I mean,
well, we're looking at what the equivalent statement.
Right. I mean, if Pelosi is the speaker because God put her there,
And did God put
then Trump is the president because God put him there, right? I mean, you can't. I don't know how you. Right? You can't.
Have one without the
You
other.
can't have one without the other, right? It seems to me, right? So as much as when somebody says, I'm grateful to God that, God was, I mean, that's not really a theological statement, right? And it shouldn't be taken as one. But if we're going to really talk theology, then that becomes, I think, a problematic statement, right? But so God is dead is one Jewish theological response to the Holocaust. Second one is the eclipse of God, okay? And this was what Martin Buber called the Holocaust, okay? Eclipse of God. Okay, and it's actually, it's a very clever idea because during an eclipse, right, if it's a lunar eclipse, the moon is still there, right? It's just not visible, right? And so God was eclipsed. Doesn't mean that God isn't there. And there's a biblical equivalent to this called Hester Panim. God sometimes says, Hester Panim means hiding of the face, right? God says, if you do such and such, astir panai mikem, I will hide my face from you. Right? Doesn't mean that God isn't there, but God is.
He's withdrawn
his
support.
His support, right? He's withdrawn his protection, his visibility. Okay. All right. Another response is a limited God, right? I mean, God is not omnipotent. God does not have the power to bring things like the Holocaust to a halt, right? And who is the contemporary theologian who I think is most identified with this idea? Had a big bestseller 35 years ago. Harold Kushner. Right? Right? When bad things happen to good people, right? And often people say, why? It's not why, it's when, right?
Yeah.
But what is Kushner's argument? Kushner's argument is that when God created humanity, he created us with free will. Right? And God wrote, I was going to say he, but I'm trying to avoid that, right? God wrote,
We'll make it feminine now.
God wrote into the system that God self-limited, right? God designed it in such a way that God cannot intervene, all right? That God cannot intervene because to intervene undoes human free will, right? So, I mean, you know, as I said at the end of last class, because I went back and watched it, right? Why did the Holocaust happen? Why did it happen? Because the Germans decided to kill the Jews, and the world decided, we'll watch, right? That's why it happened, right? The question is not why it happened. The question is, why didn't God stop it? Right? And God didn't stop it, Kushner would say, because God couldn't stop it, because God designed the laws of the universe in such a way that God could not stop it. Because if God had stopped it, he would have taken away Hitler's free will. He would have taken away Roosevelt's free will, etc. Right? And so you can't have free will and divine omnipotence at the same time. Right? It's a decision God made. God could have decided otherwise. Right? But then we wouldn't have free will, or we'd have only limited free
This is
will.
going
Yes.
back to what we wrote, right? I mean, we
Yeah,
wrote
absolutely.
about that car accident thing, and
Right.
like that was kind of where I was at. I was that one that set in motion. All of us had a little bit of what you're going
Right. Yeah. So, wait, Sue's first.
Oh, I mean,
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
You know, like, if you are the mother of a child that is murdered, then, in other words, the Holocaust, of course, happened to millions of people. But to this mother who lost a child, God is looking the other way, the same as to the people in the Holocaust.
Sure.
So, in other words, I guess what I'm saying is that, in a sense, this problem, even without the Holocaust, still exists.
Sure.
Right, that's what we
Only
said.
on
Yeah.
a smaller.
The car accident,
Right.
every
Yeah.
one of those things. Was he looking the other way?
Yeah.
Is there no God? Right?
Right.
Each individual, we go through that, not just.
Right. No, absolutely. I mean, but so the Holocaust, in that sense, is not a difference in kind, but only of degree.
Right.
Yeah.
No, you know, absolutely, you're right. That, I mean, I could say more, but I don't want to get bogged down. But you're absolutely right. I mean, if you're a mother whose kid was murdered, it's the exact same theodicy problem as the Holocaust. It's just on a much smaller scale.
Yeah, I think Robert Reggio must have talked about it once or at least twice.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And I think what he said was basically, Dave's up there, and it's, you know, it's our hands that act for him, or for the Shekhinah. You know, that, you know, so what we do is, because of the free will, and if we do good things, that's good. And if we do bad things, well, that's, again, the free will that we have. Is that sort of the same?
Well, I mean, it's a related idea, right? But it is a related idea. But the question is simply, I mean, if you're going to be, you know, theologically consistent, right, then you can't have God intervening here and there, but not
Here and not there.
Yeah. Right. No, absolutely, and it's not. I mean, I've said similar things about us being the hands of God, right? I mean, I know that I have. You know, and so this is not unique to Kushner by any stretch. I mean, and Kushner, I mean, having said that, Kushner's a rabbi. He's not an academic, right? And an academic could poke holes in Kushner's theology, but I think that for many of us, that theology brings comfort, right? Only because when people rationalize horrible things, right? It's of so little comfort, right? I mean, it's like, how many times have you heard somebody say, God never gives you more than you can bear, right? Well, first of all, if a tragedy had happened in my family, and I have to say I'm very fortunate. I haven't had, anything in my family that, I lost a close friend once to a horrible accident, but that's, first of all, so, if I, God forbid, I don't know, whatever, it doesn't matter. And somebody said to me, well, God never gives you more than you can bear. I would say, well, I wish I was a weaker person, because then...
That was my mother. She had everything happen to her.
Right.
She was strong. So was that what you say?
Right. But, so maybe if I was a weaker person, this wouldn't have happened, right? No. Because, here's what's true and here's what's false. I absolutely do believe that God does not give us more than we can handle, because God is not in the process. We are given more than we can handle. We are given more than we can handle, and it happens a lot, and it sucks, and I think God cries along with us. And that when somebody says something that's that hurtful, even though they're well-meaning, that God cries for that as well. I really do. So that's Kushner. There are other things. Eliezer Berkovitz, who was an Orthodox thinker, stresses that God is all-powerful, but God curtails his own freedom to respect human freedom, even with such horrific consequences. So, that's a subtle distinction, I think, right? That Kushner says, no, he couldn't even if he wanted to. And Berkovitz says, well, he does want to, but he doesn't, because he doesn't want to take away our freedom. Yeah.
So how does Judaism explain how God makes his decision? Like, if you were an Egyptian and you were pursuing the Jews, and you had loved ones that drowned in the sea, then if you look at that, in other words, God, there's free will, but God made a decision, right, or a decision was made. Should the Jews have been captured and brought back, or should the Egyptians have drowned, or should, there's, like, even with free will, like, how do you decide, or how is it decided that one thing gets done and not the other?
Well,
in some cases, it's the bad thing that's done. In other cases, like the people that survived the Holocaust, things.
Right. Well, what I'm trying to demonstrate is that when you say, how does Judaism, that there's no such thing. There's a variety of approaches, right? Now, if you want to look at the biblical, purely the biblical level, the most plain shot, right? That the doctrine is really collective. It's not individual, right? So the Egyptians got what was coming to them. And I would say, you say, well, so the Egyptian, he had relatives. German soldiers had relatives too, right? But, and people on the border putting kids in cages have relatives also, right? But we have pretty well established that us just following orders is not an acceptable answer, right? And so, I guess I could say, well, that Egyptian soldier should have told Pharaoh, no, I'm not going.
But I guess what I was driving at is, in other words, like during the Holocaust, some people survived, regardless of what happened to them, and other people, passed away because of what happened. And so it's like, even even if it's free will, it's still arbitrary. You know, it's not like,
right.
because the soldiers are trying to kill everybody, but some people.
Right,
are trying
and
to
which
kill
gets back to the tree from a month ago, right? I mean, stuff happens that is arbitrary, and it, you know, it just does. I mean, it does. I certainly have no answer. I mean, I think, you know, I mean, a more orthodox answer could be, you know, that's what God wanted, and just because you don't understand it doesn't mean it's not God's will in some way, and therefore just and deserved in some way. It's not my answer, right? Now, all right, so I can't go through all of these, right? But here's, and there's a very interesting thinker. I don't know if any of you have heard of Rabbi Irving Greenberg, sometimes known as Yitz Greenberg. Very controversial modern Orthodox thinker, okay? Written also controversial because of things that he's written about Christian-Jewish relations. But, and so, you know, I mean, there's always a debate about who's really Orthodox, right? And I think many other Orthodox Jews would say Yitz Greenberg is a former Orthodox rabbi.
Oh.
Right.
It's off the derech.
Yeah, he's right. He's gone off the derech. He's gone off, you know, off the path. But Greenberg essentially says God broke the covenant. Right? In other words, God broke the covenant. That God promised to protect us. He didn't do so. He broke his side of the deal. Now, what he's doing with this is a very humanistic approach. Therefore, he says that, you know, so pre-Holocaust, right? Pre-Holocaust, right? I get up in the morning, I put on tefillin because God said I had to, right? God broke the covenant. I don't have to do it anymore. The fact that I choose to do it, right, makes it that much more meritorious, right? Because God no longer has the right to call me to account for my failures towards him because of his colossal failures towards all of us, right? I mean, you know, and I mean, I don't know that holds water theologically. I mean, it certainly holds water practically, right? I mean, you know, most Jews don't think twice about not observing things that they don't observe, right? I mean, they don't. We all pick and choose, and why do we pick and choose? What?
I said I do think about it. I might not follow it, but I usually recognize.
All right, so maybe you do think twice, but you pick and choose, right?
Which ones to absolutely.
And why do you pick and choose? Because you think you have that right. I guess maybe you don't. I don't know. Maybe you know. I don't know. Maybe people don't really think about it that much at all, right? I mean, but it seems to me. It seems to me that most of us believe that we have the right to choose what to do or not to do, right? I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe
we do make the decision, and
but a lot of it starts with family too. Like we followed this and didn't follow that, so now I need to add some. I need to keep some of those.
We follow it and don't follow that, but I would venture to guess that. I mean, speaking entirely for myself, I am way, way more observant than my parents, right? I'm way more observant than the way that I was raised, right? I mean, my father, may he live and be well, I have known him to literally eat pork on Yom Kippur. Right? Right? You know, so it's not just a question of how we were raised. Right? I mean, I don't know all your own personal histories or your level of observance, but I suspect I'm probably not the only person in this room who's more observant than their parents were. Right? So, what?
In certain ways, yes.
In certain ways, yes, and in certain ways, no.
In certain ways, because
Right.
the comment,
For sure.
Yeah.
my sister made a comment once. She said, you know, we followed a lot of what my mother did, but we do a little bit more. She said, you know, we really, in a way, are more observant than our mother was. And the question is, yeah.
But that's how women are included more too. Some of that,
Pardon?
some of that is women too. I mean, my mom couldn't have gotten up and done half of it until she was much older than me,
Yeah.
just because what's accepted in conservative Judaism. But I think about it. I guess that's the part where I don't know 613 but when I know the ones that I'm breaking them, I usually have some little voice going, "You're doing it."
Okay.
I just don't
Yeah,
follow
okay.
it
Yeah,
because,
okay.
but the voice is there almost all the
I
time
think
bothering
part
me.
of that realization or concern is also related if we belong to a shul or not. Because you're
You
much
hear it.
more, whether you will,
Right, studying it
aware of,
really.
Right. I mean, no, I think that, right.
especially if you have a rabbi like
Yeah.
Rabbi Arian.
Yeah,
Right. Well, I think that, look, our context definitely determines what we do. And even in conservative shuls, there are certain, I mean, it's far stronger in Orthodox shuls, right? That, you know, you do this because this is what we do, right? I
There's more
mean,
community pressure in a way.
right, there's
Yeah.
a lot of, whereas there's not a lot of community pressure, but there is some. I mean, particularly if you talk about not the entirety of the shul, but the group of people who participate more regularly, who come to classes, who come to services, et cetera, right? That there is a certain, you know, people may say, well, you know what, kashrut really isn't all that important to me, but I keep a kosher home because I like my fellow congregants to be comfortable eating in my house, as an example, right? Or, you know, you wake up one Saturday morning and it's like, I'm just not feeling it today. I'd really like to sleep in, right? But other people are kind of depending on
There might not be
There might not
Right.
be a minion.
Yeah, but yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to digress for just a second. But in any other time period in Jewish history, like where there was persecution or the Jews were in school, right now we're talking about the Crusades and what happened to the Jews then, and being kicked out of England and France and Spain. You know, were there any writings from the rabbis about the same thing, like where is God now that this is happening to us?
Well, I'm sure that there were, but mostly, and this is again a good segue, and I'll end with this because I can't possibly cover all of these, right? But look, the traditional Jewish answer is mipnei chata'enu, because of our sins, right? These things happen to us because of our sins, and remember, it's a collective. It's not individual, right? So I myself may be, you know, a fully faithful Jew, but maybe 2 generations earlier my ancestors sinned, right? And so the task is to sort of say, why is this happening to us? Because of our sins. Okay, what sin specifically? Right? What sin specifically? And that is, you know, as I said a month ago, if you ask, for example, the Satmar Rebbe, okay, and it's interesting, right? Because you have this executive order that came out yesterday, which is certainly far from the end of the world that many people believed it was, right? But it essentially, without in so many words, says anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism. In which case, the Satmar Rebbe is the greatest anti-Semite in the world, right? But you ask a Satmar Jew, why did the Holocaust happen? Well, all right, let me think of all the reasons. Reform Judaism, conservative Judaism, modern Orthodox Judaism, Zionism, Jewish socialists, Jewish communists, etc., 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 etc. Right? That the Holocaust was a punishment for our sins. And again, it's collective, so that even though many, many, many fine, pious Jews were killed during the Holocaust, the collective of the nation of Israel sinned. And so we were punished. Right? I mean, there's a secular Zionist, could be even atheist version of the same thing. Right? Why did the Holocaust happen? Because for 2,000 years we were weak, right? And we refused to arm ourselves, and we refused to defend ourselves, and we refused to fight to regain our homeland. And that's the sin for which the Holocaust was a punishment. It was Jewish weakness, Jewish impotence, Jewish passivity, right? It's internally consistent, right? It's clearly not my perspective, right? But it's internally consistent, right? So I think that for most of Jewish history, that would have been the answer, right? Because of our sins, or I mean, and we see some of this in the high holiday literature, right? Liturgy. Our ancestors suffered so greatly for your sake, right? Therefore, give to us the merit that they earned, right? And I mean, we see on Yom Kippur, certainly in the martyrology, but we see it on Rosh Hashanah and all of the references to Isaac bound on the altar and so on and so forth. So that would be another, that there's a sort of transgenerational both punishment and reward, right? So that people of a particular generation may have suffered and it was unmerited, but it could have been a prior generation, or it could be that, well, at least we'll get the merit for what they went through. There's a balancing of the scales. Barnaby, you want to say something?
So I just wanted to comment on one of the purported Jewish theological responses to the Holocaust was that, quote, God is dead. And that's a direct copy of Friedrich Nietzsche, the forerunner of Nazi ideology. And why is it that, we have a reflexive response to give credence to the enemy, to essentially validate that the ideology of nihilism that had led to the Holocaust in the first place.
Right. Well, I mean, I would say that most. I mean, that's obviously not my theology, right? And it's not my task to defend perspectives that I don't hold, right? But I would say that for most of the Jewish God is dead thinkers, right, they would say, nevertheless, the task is to remain faithful even though God hasn't, right? I mean, certainly if you look at, Richard Rubinstein, or even Sherwin Wine, who was the founder of humanistic Judaism, okay, who's, which I personally I certainly don't subscribe to, right? But the task would be to live our lives as if God still existed, even though God doesn't exist. Right? So it's not nihilistic at all. It's quite the opposite, right? In some ways, right? And in that sense, it kind of, I mean, it echoes Yitz Greenberg, right? That is all the more, the things that we do today are all the more meritorious because either because there's no God telling us that we have to do it because God doesn't exist, or for Greenberg, there's no God telling us to do it because God has forfeited the right to tell us to do it. Look, the question is always, and it's a legitimate question, right? I mean, do we automatically reject certain intellectual concepts because of their antecedents? Right? I mean, in that sense, I mean, look, if you look at Zionism, right, which arose in the context of the rise of nationalism in Europe, right? I mean, Rome and Jerusalem, right? There were surgiment and so on and so forth. Now, nationalism has brought untold suffering to humanity, right? And certainly to Jews, right? Does that mean, now, if you want to say, therefore, that invalidates Zionism, you have that right. I wouldn't say that, right? I mean, I have a lot of problems with certain forms of Zionism, but I'm very much a Zionist, right? And even though, we might be, imagine a world with no nationalism. Okay, great. And I will be very happy for the Jews to be the 40th or 50th nation to give up nationalism, but not the first, right? But I think it's a legitimate question. Do the antecedents of an idea invalidate it? You can say yes, but I think it ultimately gets you down a lot of dead end alleys.
I wouldn't say it invalidates it, but on the other hand, why are you essentially making it a self-fulfilling prophecy? Saying that the point I'm trying to express here is when Nietzsche expressed the thought that because of modernism, society modernizing, people aren't God-fearing anymore. The moral barriers just crumble away like that. Then having a nevertheless, we should, we should be moral, kind of runs moot when you have people who said, nah, we're not going to be moral, and then they became the Nazis.
Right.
We have to, analyze where each thought comes from.
Right. No, I hear you. I hear you. All right. So it's not the death of God, but it's the end of God. And what we're going to look at further on, I'm not sure yet what order, and some of this was covered in the antecedents of this class last spring, but I think it's worth going over again. We're going to look at revelation, we're going to look at halacha and authority, and sort of modernity and the challenge of Jewish identity. All right?
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.